Hello, everybody. You've turned into the GrowWire podcast. I'm your host, Jason Maynard, and today we're talking about the intersection of technology, digital media, and old media. And we've got an expert on the subject, the one and only Sean Atkins. Sean, former executive at Discovery, MTV, HBO, Yahoo. I like to refer to him as the transform and growth executive. He has seen all sorts of changes going on in consumer behavior, how it impacts media, how it changes what you do if you're a brand, big and small. I think you're going to really like to hear about his experiences and, most importantly, his lessons about what you do when things change and how you adapt.
You're listening to the GrowWire podcast, a place where you'll learn the ins and outs of growing a business, running a business, or even taking your big idea, career, or personal development to the next level. It's all possible. Our host, Jason Maynard, the SVP of Marketing at Oracle NetSuite and the Editor-in-Chief of GrowWire.com, will take you on an exploration of growth through candid conversations with some of the most brilliant minds in entrepreneurship, entertainment, business development, and more. Whatever your goal, we know you'll walk away with the right tools to help fuel your own journey of growth.
Now, before we get into our interview with Sean Atkins, I want to quickly thank Blue Microphones for sponsoring this episode of the GrowWire podcast. Thank you, Blue. Everybody has a story to tell, and if you're a storyteller, you probably know Blue Mics for their iconic Yeti microphone, which has helped millions of people find their voice. If you're thinking about creating your own podcast, music, or anything, check out Blue's new Yeticaster, the complete mic and boom arm system, ready to connect to your laptop, bringing the ultimate broadcast studio set up to your home office. Visit bluedesigns.com and use the code podcast at checkout for a very special GrowWire price. I also want to make sure you head over to our website. Yeah, we got a website, growwire.com. If you haven't been there, you really should go. You're going to find articles about growing your big ideas, your business, all sorts of things. One of my favorite articles that we have is an article about how to properly tell your story and why it's an important factor for your whole company, not just the marketing department. Marketing is too important to be left to the marketing department. You got to tell the whole story. So go check it out on growwire.com. Sean, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Sean Atkins, digital media executive, lived the wars of the old media, new media, converged media. Maybe give folks a little bit of background about yourself and how you got here and your point of view on the world.
Sure. So I always tell people that I'm a transform and growth executive. I've been very lucky that my career is basically sat at the intersection of kind of consumer behavior shifts, technology and media, and where they've all kind of been getting messy together. So across my career, I've been in startups that have done ad tech and media and consumer internet. I've worked for major brands in the media space like HBO and Disney and MTV. And across those, I've really been sort of with my team sitting at the front seats of almost all the kind of transformative stuff we've seen. So early days of direct-to-consumer, early days of the cable business. I helped build a startup that's one of the biggest unscripted reality TV production companies in the world today. Did some of the initial over-the-top streaming stuff you guys know in terms of HBO, a lot of the early music streaming work, a lot of e-commerce in the early days when all you need a URL like pets.com or eToys and you could make money. Those were the good days. And throughout that, I've really sort of built a reputation of being kind of a right brain, left brain type who really loves to kind of ideate and build those kind of new opportunities to take advantage of those trends and then operationalize them and grow businesses out of them.
Yeah, we're going to get into a lot of talk about the intersection of digital and what's going on in the media world and your outlook. But I want to go back to when you early on when you started, when you were coming out of school, like what were you thinking you wanted to go do?
I actually grew up overseas. So my mom was like a serial entrepreneur, small business entrepreneur. My father was a 35-year veteran of banking, of which we did a big stint as a family overseas because he was in international banking.
Where about?
Mostly in the Philippines.
Oh, wow.
So I actually, true story, if your listeners want to look it up, I was a child actor in Asia, so I'm sure you can find some very entertaining things about me. I did not know that. Yeah, so I've always challenged people to please find some of the early stuff I did on YouTube, which I've still not been able to find, and I'm sure will be embarrassing, but I would love to see it again. And so out of that sort of became this sort of like right brain, left brain, that I love the idea of finding new opportunities. And my mom and dad always really encouraged this. And then from my dad's side, sort of how do you really sort of operationalize that? And so in the early days when I was first going into college, I actually wanted to go into the hotel business because my best friends in the Philippines, their father ran the Westin hotels. And he was very encouraging that if I went into hotel management, he would essentially give me a GM. And then, of course, once I got into the schools, he flew in from China and talked me out of it. There I was, as my parents were like, yay, full rides to like Cornell. And then I'm like, I'm not going. So when I went into to USC in undergrad, I really was your classic 18-year-old, had no idea what I was going to do, right? Like undeclared, took a lot of things. I thought maybe that I'd go into medicine, because what kid doesn't want to be a doctor at some point? And our family doctor talked me out of that. So I had a lot of great mentors telling me what not to do. And one day I discovered the famous USC Film School. And it literally had this, what I call 18-year-old logic. Wait, you can make movies and TV shows as a degree? I like watching movies and TV shows.
This is a job?
Yeah, correct. And
you paid for it?
And what is one of the great things I always tell people when you're sort of thinking about being entrepreneurial, what made me get into the school is I actually didn't know how impossible it was to get into that school. I didn't know that its rejection rate was like 99%. Like nobody told me that because I didn't do it the natural way. I kind of came in the intro. So I applied and got in, and that program is amazing. But what I quickly learned, and this will sound a little bit like semantics, that I was really attracted to being what I would call a creator, but not a creative. So most of my much more talented classmates were like, I really want to be a feature film director. I really want to be Steven Spielberg. That's what I want to do. And I was much more attracted to getting excited about an idea and building a team, and sort of the process of finding that idea, finding kind of what today we would call product market fit. But I'm dating myself. Back in the 80s and early 90s, that as a degree in concept didn't exist. Yeah. So I ended up getting a double major in marketing and in film and television, because I knew I wanted to do something a little bit more business oriented. So when I came out of school, I really knew I wanted to be in the entertainment business in the broadest sense, but I knew that I didn't want to be like a crafts person. And so I stumbled upon the cable business. And to put this in context for people, I always remind people at this time in the business, if you went into the feature film business, that's where the talent went. If you were going to be okay, you went into one of the broadcast networks. And then there was this weird slum called cable that people didn't know if it was going to work. And in fact, when I joined Disney Channel, I was just remind people, it was a startup. I might have been employee 68. Yeah. And it was a direct-to-consumer subscription service competing against HBO. It was actually the second biggest pay after HBO. And so it was part of the team that pivoted it from there. And so it was in that experience with great mentors like Jerry Laybourne, Ann Sweeney, Frank Sinton, Rich Ross, Elio Hensley, who really encouraged us in that early entrepreneurial days to look at new opportunities. So using my international background, I helped them launch international networks. I discovered the internet at a very young age and was I think the first person in our division to have an email address. My only other friend was a friend at Microsoft I had one friend to email. Yeah. And so then I started the internet group.
Still got spam.
Yeah, correct. Still got spam. I was creating the spam, created the internet group, and then also did licensing and gaming also. So really was a great entrepreneurial footprint that I gained in my time during Disney.
Yeah. And so how long were you there?
I was at Disney for 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, it's great training. Disney is one of the best brands in the world if you really want to understand everything from how do you think about your customers, be those B2B customers or B2C customers. How do you really think about service levels, and how do you productize those service levels and operationalize? Because if you think about the business that they're in and what they do, that the DNA that is consistent is how do you have an amazing experience for your consumer, regardless of who that is, and then how do you do it very consistently when there's a lot of variables that you don't control?
Well, one of the reputations of Disney for folks working in those groups is how regimented it is and how disciplined. Yes. And you I think from the outside you sort of say, well, it's an amazing creative place.
That's correct.
Right. But at the same time, there are all sorts of labels that folks put on about how rigid. So talk a little bit. How did that shape you?
So in my own experience, it was I get my first job to go to Disney, and like anybody who loves the Disney brand, you're imagining, particularly as a young kid whose real first corporate job was that you're imagining you're going to go in there and Mickey Mouse is going to be in there and it's going to just be balloons and fun and parades in your office.
You don't wear mouse ears at work?
I remember the elevator doors opening and it just being a gray wall with a gray kind of cloth reception, those old school cube areas, and I went in, it would look like a Dilbert cube farm. And it really, and in those days, I was an assistant. I wore a suit and tie.
Yeah.
And it was so completely antithetical to what I expected. Now, great creative, talented people, but what Disney, and this is one of the misnomers I always tell people about creativity. They have a tendency to, there's this sort of archetype. People think about creatives as these wacky, crazy people. You put them in a corner and they just, with no constructs, exist. And what Disney knows better than anyone else is actually creativity does require, and actually thrives with some level of constraint. I've often said to my teams, if I walked into my product teams and said, I think that people, young people want a new product, I'll spend $10 billion on it, go. They'll probably be paralyzed. But if I said, I think that people between 16 to 18 have a real need to communicate in a secretive way with one another. We only have $100,000 to experiment and it has to really work on mobile. I'm probably going to get a lot more ideas, right? Because the constraint helps the process. And so Disney's pretty good at, I say, operationalizing creative, which sounds like a misnomer, but the truth is, like, it's a human process. Like all human processes, you can guide it to some level of operational success, and they're probably one of the best companies in the world at it.
Yeah. So you in the late 90s were, the internet started to take off, right? We're mid to late 90s, all sorts of crazy ideas. You made the joke about e-toys and pets and all that. But this notion of what we're now talking about with cord cutting and over the top and streaming, these ideas were being presented everywhere back then.
That's right.
So talk a little about some of the early ideas that you were working on, whether it was at Disney or in your startup.
So probably the best example of this would be the work that the team did on the early days of what became HBO Go. It was called HBO Broadband back when I was working with Jim Moleshock and Carmi Zlotnick and Chris Albrecht and the gang. When we were working on that, it really was this question of like, look, consumers are going to want to consume in new ways. That the hypothesis really becomes, look, the media or entertainment business in the broadest sense has morphed into a consumer products business. And consumer products business requires not only to have consistently improve your product, but consumers expect to extract more value at the same economics. And particularly as sort of you look in the future and say, well, if broadband penetration really goes this way, all of a sudden, like the normal controls we have from a geographic or even like a legal control is going to move distribution barriers. You start to think like, where can this go?
You all had the chart showing broadband penetration.
That's correct. It's going to go like 100%.
It's
a classic chart. Any new technology goes, they're like, well, televisions did, and then VCRs did, and then mobile phones do it, and they always assume the next one's going to do it in like 18 months. And not always, but sometimes. And so it wasn't hard to sort of see the opportunity. But I think what a couple things happened. The speed didn't happen at which people thought it did, because a lot of other things, processing power, broadband penetration at the levels that were really necessary for the highest quality weren't there. When we launched Entertaindom, I think broadband penetration was like 18%. And so we did some of the first streaming MP3s ever, some of the first time that streaming content that what ultimately became Netflix, some of the first stuff, we called it community, you call it social. The first time we did, today, people take contextual content, commerce for granted. We were doing it then, but you didn't have the enough audience scale that the segmentation you were already trying to work at would work, because you were just sort of at pre-mass. And then you didn't have enough, not enough bandwidth, you didn't have enough processing power on the computers, like all the variables were all sort of at the nascent stages. So in a lot of ways, people were right, but a little bit too early. The secondary issue was the classic innovator dilemma. Like collectively, the media business or any business who's facing this sort of transformation, look at automotive versus Uber or whatnot, is that you have a business model, and particularly in media, that prints you these beautiful, protected, 40, 50, sometimes 60% margins. And so going into something that's not attractive, you don't know when it's going to turn around, was really tough for them. And so you end up in a situation, if you look in retrospect at, say, HBO versus Netflix, both of them were launching a streaming service at the same time. HBO ultimately decided, rather than to go fully direct, to attach it to their core business. By the way, it made sense. It moved LTV significantly, even though we built the direct one first. And today, you read in the AT&T thing, what is Stanky saying is like, you need to be going direct, which is funny because 10 years ago, it's actually the first thing that was built. But when you had a $6 billion business dependent on Comcast not getting mad about you having a direct relationship, you didn't do it.
Yeah.
And it's no different than, why did Unilever have to buy, Dollar Shave Club when they completely controlled the shaving market? Because it was really tough for them to do a model this way. I'm not sure when this is going to make money. And same challenge in almost every business model that I've worked in.
You spend a little bit of time doing a startup as well.
I did.
Talk a little bit about that experience, because I think that, so you go from Disney, right? And how do you decide to leave?
I've done every variation of a startup. I've done them completely bootstrapped. I've done them venture backed. I've done them corporate venture backed. And so I got into sort of this combination of technology and media actually as a young kid, because over in Asia, my first entrepreneurial thing was when my mom started writing software code. I got into it at the same time, and she went away on a business trip. And when she came back, she had discovered that I'd started a software piracy ring where I'd import video games from the United States, modify them, and sell the sequel in Asia. And so my mom has this horrifying...
The FBI is not listening.
My mom has this horrifying moment where she's like, this is fantastic. I want to reward the entrepreneur, but not the crime. And so obviously I was not allowed to keep doing that. When she instructed me, it's like, that's illegal. I was 12. I was like, oh. So, I sort of started in that way. So my first startup actually was Entertainment, which was backed by Warner Brothers and Terry Semel and Jerry Libin back in those days, which was really this early broadband play. And look, I worked with some amazing talent. Jeff Weiner ran all the finance in that group.
Oh, wow.
That team all went over to run Yahoo. And so when we built that startup quite successfully, and I ran all of product at that time, they all went to Yahoo, and I went to MediaCax, which was a venture-backed startup. And so that was a very early mover in the ad tech space. And actually, just with my co-founder a month ago on the phone, we were laughing that what took us 30 slides to explain, and the venture capitalists literally fought us on every point, today is one sentence and taken for granted. And because what we really believed was that the transaction of media, or the understanding of understanding your audiences, was going to get digitized and more data intensive, and that also the selling of the product, whether that be a direct asset to somebody or the advertising revenue, was also, while it was really heavy data oriented, but very physical and people oriented, was going to move much like what you saw in the travel industry, where Sabre came in and said, look, you need to be able to yield manage at every component. So essentially we're building that. And we were 100%, I always tell people, we were 100% correct, and our timing was 100% wrong. And what I tell my entrepreneurs that I mentor today, I said, it turns out, if I had to say today, I preferred the times in my career I was just wrong. It's more painful to be right and your timing to be wrong, because everything we did then is sort of is the state of the business today, right? Yeah. People transact. It's all data oriented. You just, again, much like what happened at Entertainment, we were at a point where you still had enough of the players still hadn't come to terms with a comfort level of releasing information or cloud. When we had to do our sales, we had to sell in browser-based delivery. We had to sell in cloud, which those words didn't exist. So people were like, what do you mean my data sits on your, right? We had to sell in that it was, that it was a service level architecture. Like all these things were new. And so it took another 5 to 7 years for those to become acceptable and norm. And so then you started seeing that world blow up. Although the thing I tell people we got wrong in the ad tech space is that when I looked at the value chain, I had assumed that I assumed it would be like travel, like a couple data providers would be in the middle enabling everything, and that the value chain ends would sort of extract the value. So airlines get more economics because they know what's happening in so do hotels. And then, stuff like Expedia shows up, or they can, the buyers can yield manage. Whereas in the ad tech business, in the MarTech business, the economics have accrued to all the providers in the middle. So the end value, the content creator or seller or the advertising buyer is using all these tools, but they're not accruing economics of lower cost into the thing. And so what you're seeing, this interesting thing, is they're putting more economics into data tools and then trying to extract the cost structure out of the other end of the value chain. So that's the thing we got wrong.
Yeah, we're going to take a quick break and come back and talk a little bit more about the intersection of technology, digital, and media.
Great.
Which American company started with a guy in a garage, was featured on Shark Tank, and now has over 1 million customers? Hint, they're reducing crime in neighborhoods everywhere. Here's Ring Video Doorbell founder Jamie Siminoff with his secret to success.
It's true. In just a few years, we've had huge growth. We've hired hundreds of people, expanded our warehouse, and we're shipping millions of units a year, all while making sure our customers are happy. I've had lots of things to worry about, but I never worry about our finance and accounting because we use NetSuite from Oracle. From the beginning, NetSuite let me see what's going on with my business in real time. from revenues to expenses, customers and orders, even HR. I run my business from a dashboard right on my phone. NetSuite has been my business management system from 10 to a team of over 1,000, and NetSuite will be my choice as we continue to innovate and grow.
Go to netsuite.com/ring to see how Jamie scaled his business. You'll also get our free guide titled Overcoming Your 5 Obstacles to Growth. That's netsuite.com/ring for your free guide and the story of a great American company. netsuite.com/ring.
So you've actually then sat at the intersection of this, old media, new media, when you were at Yahoo, Discovery, MTV. Talk a little about making the move to Yahoo, because that's been such an interesting, I don't want to call it an asset, but an interesting company, an asset over the years. And
yeah, look, it's funny. A couple times in my career, because this is going to be a little bit analogous if we end up talking about MTV, I've gone to brands in transition.
Yeah.
Because they have great leaders, and those leaders, it was Terry Semmel and Jeff Weiner and Dan Rosenweg and Sue Decker and that group. Really, were sort of like, okay, what do we do for the next version of Yahoo? They sort of resuscitated it. And so I went in and worked for Lloyd Braun in this position that was sort of like a COO over all of the media and entertainment assets, working for this great guy named Vince Brody.
They were trying to be a content company back then, right?
Yeah, so
sort of?
Yeah, exactly. And so ultimately what happened to Yahoo, which is not new news, everyone's looked at it, is that Yahoo really always struggled at being more than one thing. And for someone like me, who comes from a technology and a media background, I don't really struggle with it at all. Like, it is. And there are companies who don't struggle with this who are fantastic. Pixar, it's both. Netflix, it's both, right? And Lucasfilm, you could argue, LucasArts and all was both. And so it's not, Disney, frankly, actually has done some of the most technologically advanced stuff. So if it's at your DNA, if you're born a media and technology company, they seem to do exceptionally well. But if you sort of evolve into it from a technology perspective, they have a tendency to struggle. Yeah. And so there was always this sort of fight for the soul, as sort of the Yahoo original culture would describe as like, what are we? And plus then there was the fight over search. And the search resources were so all-consuming that if you went in for a pitch, you said, I think we should, do this in content or that in content. The question would be like, is that going to be more valuable to us than search? And since both were unknown answers, but you had this public entity called Google was printing cash, you just lose the argument on the hypothetical what might happen in success. And so it starved almost every other asset at Yahoo. Again, not through malicious intent, just because the strategic decision that they chose, which ended up being, I could argue was the right decision, maybe not executed fast enough or whatever. It starved the rest of the building. So because at Yahoo, when my team was there, think about stuff that we had under music. They had the only service that you could see every music video today, known as Vivo. Right? They had live streaming radio subscription service today, known as Spotify or Pen. You could name whichever one. They had it. We had Flickr, the number one photo uploading thing, which was supposed to add video before YouTube really blew up. We had broadcast.com, which streamed video. We had something called Yahoo Platinum. It was a subscription video that was sort of like what an MVPD today. It was actually profitable, but small. Worked. We had the biggest social gaming footprint by a factor of like 100. So like everything that exists today was actually at Yahoo, and that's the heartbreaking thing when you talk to Yahoo.
And then you think about Yahoo Finance.
Yahoo Sports. Yahoo Sports was beating ESPN. Yahoo. We were at the table on Hulu. And so again, I always tell people, it's like, look, you can't in your history assume we would have executed correct on all of them. But I always tell people, it's like, there's enough of that they had a seat at the table that when you have 20 of them, they would execute it on like 5 maybe.
Yeah, which would have been a game changer.
Which would have been game changing. And so I think that really ultimately was one of the downfalls for them, was ultimately sort of that search fight and the fact that it just took resources, and then the cultural inability to decide it's okay to be a technology-enabled, content company. Because look, at content companies at the end of the day, they sell attention. Like, I always laugh when people are like, well, Facebook isn't a media company. If it's not a media company, what's a media company? Yeah. It sells attention. That's it. Google sells attention. Now, they use technology to enable it, but they sell attention. That's all they sell at the end of the day.
Well, what's fascinating to me about your career then is, so you then worked at Discovery.
Correct.
Right? So you talk about sort of like the heart and soul.
Yeah.
So one, a tech company trying
That's
to
right.
move into media. Now you're at a media company.
Correct. Now I went to the opposite problem.
Now you're at the opposite problem. So
Well, because my background, which is relatively unique, that I've done large scale product and technology and engineering teams, and I'm not sitting around writing the code myself, but I can have a great conversation. I have those relationships, and because I've also produced hit content, it makes me a unique animal for all these people trying to, we need someone. Like I said to people, like half the time when I get the call from a recruiter or from a friend where they described it, it was like, there's like 5 of us. The other 4 are far more charming than I am. You should hire them first. Usually when it's a build, I get a build conversation. So like in the case of Discovery, they called me because they decided they were going to start to build a studio. Like, we have all this distribution. We do tens of thousands of hours, but we actually buy it from outside. You should start vertically integrating. By the way, this is not new news. This is what HBO did. This is what Netflix did, right? I built my distribution using other people's. Now I start vertically integrating to own that, to actually own the product that I'm distributing. Amazon's doing this, right, with Amazon Basics, right? It's not a new strategy. And because I had built one of the biggest unscripted companies from scratch in the early days, where I was told, like, when the words unscripted in reality didn't exist, it was sort of a good fit for them. And then my 7 years that I spent at Discovery was this great experience where about every 18 months I got to go build them a new business line, which is really, it told me, it was like, it's the most serial entrepreneur I've gotten to be, but backed by a corporate entity.
Yeah. And what'd you learn from the Discovery side in terms of how did they enable that to happen, to avoid some of the conflict you'd seen with, like you described in the Yahoo example?
So first of all, Discovery is a bit unique in that it sort of owns a bit of a market sector by itself. It owns like unscripted content in the broadest sense on a global basis, right? It is a brand that people have a lot of affinity for. Like if you, I always tell people,
one of the most international brands,
one of the most international businesses, and then the leadership there, JB, Bruce, David, they'll take swings. That's the one thing you have to give them for a small company in market cap in terms of, like, if you look at the scale of like what Disney's about to become versus Discovery, I think they're like going to be 5 to 10 times bigger. But Discovery takes, I would argue, Disney level swings for their, like, hey, let's go build the ESPN in Europe and go buy Eurosport and buy the Olympic rights and buy they're not messing around, right? So David really takes good swings. And so, partnering with the team there, it was really, at the board level, always the conversation, like, the world's going to go direct. How do we build those relationships? And so over my time there, we built making the product ourselves into the P&L. We built consumer products. We built e-commerce. We did a digital distribution division. We started building so all the things, I would say, is like, by the time I left, I had all the things that weren't the core. Which, if you're in a large corporation, is good and bad. It's the fun, sexy stuff, but also, since you're not the core, there can be politics involved. Yeah. And so the way it really started to leverage its capability was, like, we started inorganically, like Eurosport. We bought Eurosport. It brought a direct to consumer service into it, and then we started building them ourselves. So we built an entire platform internally to start doing those sort of businesses. And they started, we launched Discovery OTT, the authenticated stuff here in the U.S. The team launched what's called Dplay, which is sort of like a Hulu type product in the Nordics, where we own, like, kind of the equivalent of owning CBS and NBC. We own them in the Nordics. And then they just started launching Discovery Kids product direct to consumers in Asia.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So how do you end up at MTV?
So MTV had gotten to the point where the CEO had decided they wanted to bring in an outsider to start morphing the company, because it had been for about 5 years in pretty tough shape in terms of brand, in terms of what the ratings have been doing. And I would say, sort of
that audience moved online quickly.
Moved online, and there's a sort of a metric that shows that, like, MTV lost about 95% of its core audience. And look, there's no one sort of to blame, right? Like, people always ask me, I was like, there's no one to blame, but you have sort of a lot of things that happen, right? It needed financial investment, it needed some brand realignment, it needed to get some hits on the air, and then the appeal of going to try and help save one of the brands we all know and love, right? Like, that we grew up with as kids, that had this huge footprint on culture. It's sort of hard to say no when they ask. And so, really got it, and there's some great people to go in there and try and see how you can make that brand be more than just a U.S. linear network. Because look, if 10 years from now MTV is just a U.S. linear cable network, it's not going to win, because the truth of the cable business in the United States is it's a mature and shrinking business. So you can have market share fights, which is what the game has become, but you're not going to be...
You're not growing net new audience.
No. You're fighting over declining audiences. Yeah. So like MTV is the 800-pound gorilla in a shrinking, what used to be a lake and is now a pond.
Yeah, the secular, and so that's the interesting thing when you think about programming content and you have a secular shift where the eyeball went from, our age, we grew up watching the television, right? MTV, the music video, and it broke the artists in the 80s.
Right.
To now they're probably that demo is on Snapchat.
Correct.
So how do you program for something like that?
Yeah, so look, if you take economics off the table, you just follow the audience, right? Like the mistake, if you look at sort of how you manage any business, I always tell people is like, look, there's the financial management of the business. We're making a triangle, right? There's the focus on the customer, and then there's focus on your product. The companies that most of us probably admire are obsessively focused on customer because they believe everything else flows.
Yeah.
The next probably most obsessive ones are focused on product, and the ones that are pure finance generally run into trouble. And so what you want to do is be able to focus purely on customers. And obviously you have to have an eye on the other two, but you can't be, I would say, you can't be great at 3, you be great at 1, and you can be okay at a second. And you can't be, in the third one, you just have to sort of ignore. And in the case of MTV, as the audiences were shifting and things were shifting, it had moved from being product-oriented to being finance-oriented. And so, because, that business is, you look in the public documents, it's unbelievably profitable. And so it was part of the machine that enabled Viacom to buy almost $20 billion of its stock back over a few years, which was very successful until the market turned, right? And then when the market turned and then the audience started to turn at the same time, now you have a financial squeeze and you're in that moment like, well, I wish I'd invested that on the new places. That's sort of where the team today, Bob Bakish and everybody's been adjusting the business and doing a pretty good job considering the constraints that he's under. And so what you have to do is you stay focused on the customers. And so in the case of MTV, the brand still has a lot of eloquence. People care. But how do you make sure the brand exists on Snapchat? How do you make sure the brand exists on Facebook? How do you make sure the brand exists in live events and in some music relationships? So what the team was working on, and you see pieces of it today, was, we were lighting up this thing that was called MTV Studio, which is a group focused on making mobile-first content. And that group, had a very successful Snapchat channel, had brought, had grown the social footprint to over 275 million. So really shown that if you just actually focus on using the brand and making content, it works. Yeah. And that today has actually been elevated to a corporate level initiative. Now they're using that same strategy across the whole company. So it can be done. It's just what those companies are all trying to manage is like, how do I protect that beautiful margin for as long as I can as the businesses and make the investments on the other thing. And as Disney or Fox or Viacom are showing, it's a tough turn.
It's always one of the hardest transitions between the legacy business to the new business. And
very few companies make it, right?
No, you're right.
Right?
The platform shifts, whether it's a technology or in this case, consumer behavior shifts as well, are difficult to navigate.
Yeah, look, if you ask yourself from a consumer perspective, do I think that the media companies, if they'd really been customer focused, would have made Facebook? I don't.
Yeah.
But if they've been super focused, would they've done more sort of Hulu-esque JVs to think about ways and done more other ways to realize it's sort of what's happening underneath, what's happening underneath that Facebook and Google are doing to them. If you think of it just from a business model, isn't not just the attention they're taking from consumers. It's that even the attention they're taking from the business people were like, well, that's better targeting of the information I need. So if they just address that simultaneously, collectively as a group, because what advertiser doesn't want more than 2 options? You don't want a billion options, but you'd like 100, and right now they're at 2.
Yeah.
And so the pricing power that you all are experiencing, again, to the pricing question, is all accruing to the platform, right? And that doesn't help the advertiser, and certainly doesn't help the content providers over time.
We're going to take a quick break and come back and talk about the future of the media world.
Great.
If you've ever met a famous athlete at a corporate event or gotten an official autograph, chances are Steiner Sports made it happen. Here's Brandon Steiner.
We believe that there's magic in the moments that sports creates. We get customers closer to the game and help companies use the power of sports to grow their business. We've been in business 30 years, and we've had multiple systems to keep track of all the athletes and all of our customers. Multiple systems means multiple headaches. So we made the move to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite lets us replace all of our finance, inventory, and CRM functions with one convenient system. Now all the departments can see the same data. And if I have a question about our business, I can get the answer quickly.
Find out how Steiner Sports scaled their business to millions of customers. Go to netsuite.com/Steiner. You'll also get our free guide titled Overcoming Your 5 Obstacles to Growth. That's netsuite.com/Steiner for our free guide and the story of a great American company.
I wanted to get your view on what's going on in the media world right now, because there's sort of it's really interesting time, because you're seeing the purely focused, you can't call them startups anymore, but pure plays.
Yeah.
Basically disassembling or disaggregating the traditional vertically integrated model.
That's right.
At the same time, you're seeing AT&T and Time Warner, and you're going to see obviously something between Disney, Fox, and Comcast play out here in the next few months or so. You're seeing the bundling up.
Yep.
So you're seeing the unbundlers versus the bundlers simultaneously.
Yes.
So how's this going to work? How's this going to play out? What's your handicapping on this?
Well, let's answer first things first. First of all, I always like to tell people, like, what's happening is there's not going to be any less entertainment in the grand, or media in the broadest sense, right?
I argue there's going to be more.
Correct. Media consumption is only going one way up. I said it's like what energy consumption is doing. It's only going one direction.
The best time
people want more.
Best time right now is to be a TV show writer in LA.
What's happening is what the question is happening to the margins that you can make in your business models. That's actually what's happening. So,
what do you mean by that?
So look, the consumer's desire to have every waking moment and be entertained, that's only going to increase, right?
Which is frightening.
Correct. And by the way, there's other ways it's increasing, right? What happened? What are people going to do with their time when all of Los Angeles doesn't commute in a car that they have to drive anymore? Do you think they're just going to work? No, I mean, like my train ride in New York, most people are not working. They're watching and what I would say,
listening to this podcast is what
correct,
they're
listening
doing.
To this podcast, and by the way, and they're moving more and more towards longer form content, right? So they're sitting there watching, trying to do a Netflix half-hour episode, or watch half a Game of Thrones or something, or listen to a long, detailed podcast. They're not just like doing just a YouTube hit, right? So you're going to have more and more consumption opportunities happen. But what you have is that in the fight for attention, the winners are the platforms right now. If you look at where people spend most of their time right now, I think the biggest growth in attention is all moved to mobile, right? And so think of how many times you check your phone on a day. And most consumption on a mobile phone are within just, I think it's like 10 apps. And if you look at the top 10 apps, none of them are controlled by a major media company. Not one of them. I mean, you could probably start calling Netflix a major media company, but none of them are controlled by a major media company. So they've done.
Talk about the fight for attention.
Correct. They've done a poor job in the fight for attention, because where all attention moved, they actually don't have a direct presence, and so that has margin implications when there's a platform tax. So you want to put an app on Apple, you're paying a 30% tax. Mm-hmm. And so media companies are used to paying a tax. You do a film, 50% of the gate's going to somebody else. But they're not used to being another tax inside of their tax, right? And so you have this margin challenge, and you can't get around that consumers want convenience as one of their major sorts. It's the example I use at my house. I have young children, and I would argue this is now the third generation that's been digitally raised, right? Because my kids are basically 10 and younger. They come down when they say, "Dad, can I watch TV?" It's not TV that you and I used to think like there's 3 channels, we'll watch Super Friends, and then mom and dad will be like, "All right, you got to watch something healthy." It's what they mean is, can I use the TV-like device in the living room? And then they go downstairs, and this is the process. They go down, they hit a button to turn on the receiver, they push another button like 7 times to move it over to like auxiliary 7. Then they go over and they pick up a thing and they turn on the Apple TV. Then they walk over to the PC and they boot it up and they go into their account, and then they open up, they search for something they want on, say, Amazon Prime, and then they cast it over. So they've spent like 37 steps. And I tell people this story is important because what you're seeing there is, to you and I, that's a pain. To them, it's control and convenience. Yeah. So I tell people, like, when you abstract that now we're in our third generation of doing that. Yes, economic bundle that, say, cable puts together is valuable to a consumer when you think about it purely from a economic supply and demand perspective. But when you add the human being inconvenience to them, like, I'm not sure that those kids 20 years from now, when they start paying for media directly, aren't going to say, I don't care that I pay twice as much as dad paid for a bundle, as long as I have totalitarian control of who, what, where, when, why, and what sort of monetization is happening in front of me. Because my kids, if you show a commercial to them, it's like I shot a seal in front of them. They're like, what is this? What are you doing to me? I mean,
it's hilarious to watch them when they actually watch a show.
They literally try to get away from the
commercial.
television. And they'll say, like, one of my kids said to me the other day, like, Dad, why are you doing this to us? And I was like, I'm not doing this to you. Comcast won't let me fast forward through this. They're like, well, I don't like Comcast. And it was just this really interesting process. So that behavior change.
My kids are fascinated by the commercials. They're like, wow.
What is that?
What is this thing?
What is this thing? Well, usually it's a toy one, right? Like, I'd like to watch that.
They're like, wait a minute, I can see the toys
are
being offered in this.
So that behavior is, again, going to these devices and platforms that pull attention. And remember, for Google and Facebook, we are the product. Our attention is what they're selling. And they're unbelievably good at taking that crack cocaine and dialing it up and selling it to somebody else. And that tax is all accruing to them, and none of it's accruing to the content provider. So the thing you go there to find, like, I want to read an article, I need to find some of the research, is being better monetized by someone giving you the path to get there than the person who actually makes the thing you want to do.
It seems odd.
And so at some point, there's a consequence to this. So it just gets back to the scale. So the media companies, in order to compete in this world, are going into classic, like, scale gives me the ability not to compete, but to pull out costs.
Yeah.
So is Disney going to be more competitive against Netflix because they have Fox? I don't know, because they're going to spend like $100 billion on this thing, right? Well, Netflix's media cost, programming costs on an annual basis, even if you sort of extrapolate, at the worst is $10 billion. So Disney could spend twice as much for the next 5 years and make 5 times the amount of content, but they're not playing that game. So they're not actually dealing with the direct issue that they're, by the way, they can outmarket Netflix. They can give it away for a year. Every single person in the United States, you get free Disney. So they're not playing for that. They're playing for the cost advantages in the public market. Say, well, I'm going to pull $2 billion in cost in, and that's going to let me fight this fight longer. That's the way they're thinking about it, but it doesn't address the consumer issues. But if that continues, if all of a sudden they're all playing for cost containment and the platform is getting all the margins, sooner or later we as consumers will pay the price for it, right? Because all of a sudden, let's say Discovery's like, well, I can't have my 8th network, which is all about auto enthusiasts called Velocity. And there's 2% of the population really cares, but if only 2% of the population, it doesn't work in this current model, it's gone. So what happens, you'll start, the thing we're love right now is you're getting infinite content, but it'll start going away at some point because the economics don't hold anymore.
How fast do you think the cord cutting do you think it accelerates in the next 3 to 5 years?
It's not going to slow down.
Yeah.
It's at minimum is going to stay at parity. And by the way, like, losing 1% to 2% a year is a death knell. Like, if you're looking at projections for these cable guys, they'll lose 30%. 30% to them is not just 30%. 30% has sort of an exponential impact to you, because 30%, let's say, if you lose 30% of your advertising audience, advertisers don't look at it like, oh, I'll just reduce my buy by 30%. They look at it, it's a disproportionate return at some point on the loss on there. So it is a higher, in like a 30% loss to your programming costs. Remember, because they're telling the street, a cable network is giving you a 50% margin. Mm-hmm. So for easy math, let's say ESPN, it's way bigger than this, but say ESPN is making $1 billion top line and giving $500 million to the street. You're like, this is great. So if ESPN misses by 15% that year, it's got to pull, instantaneously $150 million of cost in to maintain the margin, $75 to $100 million in cost to maintain the margin. Yeah. There's only one line item in a media company's budget that has that much capital. It's called programming. Yeah. It is the product.
That's why the Ocho's gone.
Correct. So what happens over time is you have to actually eat product or figure out a way to make it cheaper. So you have to, and so that's why Netflix is ultimately winning, because Netflix is causing a behavior. And if I could use an analogy that anyone listening to this who's a child of the 80s is going to get, and everyone else probably will not. If you remember, we were kids in the 80s, we all thought we were going to die from nuclear attack from Russia. And you'd read articles that'd be like, oh, Russia has 100 nuclear bombs, and 100 nuclear bombs can kill everyone in the entire world 2 times over. And you'd be like, well, why do you need to kill everybody 2 times over? And then you read an article several months later, well, the United States now has 400. Well, now we can kill everybody 6 times over. And sooner or later, over the next kind of 15 years, we went to where like it was like 50,000 and 80. Like we literally could kill every person personally with like a nuclear bomb. And so it makes no intuitive sense from a warfare why you have to kill everybody. And in the early days, competitively, it makes sense. Like, well, I gotta keep you at parity. But at some point, what the United States figured out, and we didn't know as a public, is that it's really expensive to make bombs.
Yeah.
But we had a growing economy, and a growing economy that grows at 2-3% can keep making a lot of nuclear weapons. Whereas a state-controlled single economy that is not growing starts to have to do what? Eat into its DNA. So it starts doing stuff like, we won't build roads. We won't feed our people.
Yeah.
And then you have the Gorbachev where like our economy doesn't work and it implodes. So it turns out we use nuclear weapons as actually an economic destructive tool. That is literally what Netflix is doing to traditional media. They're like, making content is expensive. The public markets let me do it at 0. You have to do it at 50% margin. I'm just going to keep making more nuclear weapons, and you're going to try and match me. And at some point, you're going to be like, well, to make my next nuclear weapon, I got to stop making roads.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately what they've been doing to the market. So it's hard to imagine that they're going to. I think they'll get to 1 billion subs. I think there will be around for a very long time.
It's a crazy transition. What do you think that from an advertiser standpoint, or you think about a brand?
Yeah.
Is this good for a brand?
So.
How do you reach your audience?
It's a two-sided coin, right? So, look, brands just like content. Everybody wants to get a direct relationship as fast as possible. The more you can understand about your customers, again, whether it's a B2B or B2C environment, the more effective you can be in your marketing and your relationships. So everybody wants to get there. So I think the trend you'll see of major brands bringing more in-house buying capabilities in-house, more data capabilities in-house, more even content creation closer to them, I think that trend's going to continue. I think the long-term issue that I worry about is that what the brands are all doing is they're so focused on ROI, it automatically pushes them towards the monolithic duopoly. They're like, well, I can get the best performance attribution because I know if I buy search word like buy this, car, it converts, and I can do. And they're having trouble getting attribution via their kind of more traditional channels, even though those channels, whether it be a content provider, has a better environmental and brand messaging.
Or you use some of those traditional or offline channels, and your consumer goes to Google.
That's correct.
And you get to pay twice because they
correct.
click on a branded
That's
term
correct. That's
instead
correct.
of the organic listing, right?
That's correct. That's correct. Well, you like the amount, and I think it's not a small amount that happens where because people just use their search bar now as a generic way to navigate the internet. So it's like, if I'm looking for something like how to get to Oracle's headquarters, and the first thing you're going to buy the keyword Oracle, and then I'm not going to look at the second link.
No.
I just go click.
Yeah.
And you just paid for something that
much to the chagrin of every brand in the free world.
I think it's a very large percentage.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a small percentage. I would argue so we can have this rational conversation. No marketer I've met with is rationally behaving based on this assumption, though. They're still attributing that to be effective marketing when really it is a double hit. That
your COGS must go up. Your cost of goods, you think about your costs are going up.
But they'll make that assumption towards the traditional line. So there's this weird sort of desynchronous where like traditional media is paying the penalty of not having data.
Yeah.
But the penalties that should be paid on the digital side are being assumed to not be there.
Yeah.
So you have this desynchronous assumption going on. The second issue that's going on is one, if I were brands, the last thing I want are 2 people who control all of the information of how to get to my customer and the pricing of what that is. So like the brands themselves are literally making the duopoly more and more powerful every single day. And so they're making it less likely every day that their advertising costs are going to go down, that the data availability is going to get better to them because there's no reason for those guys to let off. The third issue is that then translates to the people who are making the things that you want are not accruing the economics of your spend for ROI because you're not going direct because it's more convenient from a scale perspective. It's more convenient for a lot of reasons for you to go through the platforms. But that short-term thinking means that like the New York Times that you never want to go out of business is going to go out of business.
Yeah.
And then what are you going to get? I always say this. So if you don't buy directly from Discovery or BuzzFeed, like people of scale who are making the actual content, and you're going through the platform, when they can't make on venture capital or on reduced margins anymore. What are you buying? And it sort of becomes a blank comment. I don't know why. I don't know.
Yeah.
I said, so I don't know what the answer is, but to me, it's like if I could snap my fingers, I'd be like, hey, big brands, go sit down with the major brands. Like if there was like the top 100 content entities you wished still existed in the world, and figure out who the third player is going to be.
Well, and this gets into an interesting thing is when you do have just call it a publishing or media platform. It's very difficult in those models to justify the spend relative to the duopoly where you have the attribution, and that's right. And then you talk about this, but that attribution model is really hard to prove, and every CMO at a consumer products company is under massive pressure, and it's like,
yeah. So look, it's all, so I said nobody's not acting rationally,
yeah,
but it is a weirdly constructed. I don't want to call it a house of cards because there's there,
yeah,
but it presupposes that in perpetuity that the platforms have access for the pass-through to the thing that you care about. But if the thing you care about ultimately can't economically survive, what do they pass you through to? And so this is why when I hear, even though I think it'll never happen, when I hear like a Rupert Murdoch or one of these things get mad, it's like, I feel like you should pay me, Facebook, to make news. I logically understand that. It'll never happen because when you're as powerful as they are, why would you? Yeah. I tell people all the time, it's like, look, as rational as I am, as much as I believe this, you put me in charge of a YouTube or Facebook tomorrow, you know what I'm going to do? What they're doing.
Yeah.
Because guess what? I'm incentivized by stock.
Does this mean
and I'm going to make a lot of money by doing what they're doing.
Does this mean, though, that the platforms will ultimately end up buying the content themselves? Because they've kind of dabbled. They kind of, you see all sorts of rights deals.
I would, if I was sitting around advising one of these, I'd be like, why would you buy it? Its margins are not as good. It doesn't scale as well as you do.
Drive the cost up.
Yeah, but it's like, I don't see a reason for like a Facebook. I mean, I could see like Netflix buying someone because it's just vertically integrating them.
Yep.
Okay. But I'm talking like the ones who aren't really in, like, should Google buy one? And I was like, I don't think so. At least for Facebook, what I've seen from their culture, I think it would be a massive culture mismatch. Because that is a technology company to its DNA. So it looks at like content people like you're some sort of strange animal that like. But I don't think at the end of the day that the major platforms should buy them. Amazon, Apple, maybe.
Yeah.
Amazon, Apple, maybe.
We've unfortunately ran out of time, but I want to ask you one other question. Yeah. What's next for you? What are you up to right now?
Yeah, so I just starting to poke my head up and start to take a more serious look around for what I'm going to do next. So I'm probably going to join a digital growth firm, or I might look at sort of a transformational role back at like a traditional entity. So we'll see.
There's a lot going on. Well, we got to have you back on, and when you figure out what your next plans are.
I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
All right, I hope you enjoyed the interview with Sean. Lots of good stuff there that he's seen over the years in the media landscape. Obviously, a lot more changing, and some good examples on what you have to do when things structurally change in your business, whether you're in media or not. Thanks so much to Sean for coming on this episode of the GrowWire podcast, and everyone made it possible. Thank you to all of our sponsors, our editing crew over at Lampstand, and our producer, Kendall Fisher. Adios!
You just listened to the GrowWire podcast with host Jason Maynard. Make sure to tune in every week for another episode full of tips, tools, and strategies to take your personal and professional growth to the next level. Until next time.